Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. I think we can get started. Thank you all for being here. This session is all about how we can strive for tech reporting that's more inclusive, collaborative, and globally aware. I work for a foundation called Luminate, sponsoring this panel. We support organizations working to ensure that technology respects human rights and social justice. And Luminate has supported public interest media organizations for many years. As we look at the link between tech and journalism, alongside the work we do to support groups today in the media ecosystem in extremely difficult conditions, trying to be more resilient to tech disruption, challenging tech disruption, we wanted to get a baseline sense also of how tech, big tech, social media companies are portrayed in the news. And this is the premise for this panel. What we did was we commissioned a study from the Norman Lear Center's Media Impact Project at the University of Southern California, focusing on three major markets in the global north, the US, the UK, and France. So this research is still underway and being finalized. We hope to launch it next month. But we thought the festival was an important time to give you a sense of the trends and the data that back, I think, everyone's intuitions about the obstacles to reporting on tech today. Changing a narrative is always a challenge, and all the more so when the power that needs to be challenged largely controls and shapes the infrastructure of public discourse. And finally, this topic really begs the question of what journalists in the global north can learn from the experiences of their peers in other parts of the world, in the global majority, who perhaps saw today's challenges coming. So thankfully, we have the perfect panel to explore these questions. Natalia, you're a journalist in Brazil. You co-founded Agencia Publica, Latin America's largest nonprofit newsroom. You've led numerous investigations about human rights and big tech's influence tactics. Hajira, you're the media manager for the Tech and Human Rights program at Amnesty International, focusing on AI. And before joining Amnesty, you also worked as a journalist covering social justice, gender, and tech. And Daniel, you lead Lighthouse Reports, also a nonprofit newsroom that collaborates with, I think it's 150 news outlets. And you've broken major stories on tech, surveillance, algorithmic bias, and more. So you've all had a chance to skim the early findings of this research, and thank you for being here. Daniel, can I start with you? So one of the top findings in this research is, and this is going to sound pretty obvious to you right now, but is just how much X and Elon Musk dominate coverage of the tech beat. So while you might have expected that anyway, it's the degree and the scale of it that is so staggering. So across the three markets, the terms X and Elon Musk come up more often even than the term social media. And among the individuals most mentioned in tech reporting, Elon Musk is, as you could imagine, the top name. But he's mentioned 9 times more than the second most mentioned person, who is, you can probably guess, Mark Zuckerberg. And so Daniel, my question is, obviously the fixation on tech CEOs is not new of itself, but this trend of the domination of one name in one company is quite recent. So how do you think the last 6 months have changed those dynamics, and how do journalists, how should they approach their tech coverage?
Thanks very much, Elliott, and it's nice to be here with fellow panelists with a chance to speak about this. I think the simplest answer to this is not the most tempting one. The most tempting one is to say that we should ignore him. Hands up if you're exhausted with hearing about Elon Musk. Could I just see a show of hands? So you'll be really pleased that the answer isn't going to be much about him. I don't think it's very hard to explain why he dominates in the way that he does. He dominates attention in a very similar way to the way that Trump has and continues to. He does so in tech and social media space, and it's an amount of attention which, in a very meaningful sense, in a very visible way, he has purchased. So I think with that amount of attention, as we've seen again with Trump, there are things that are obscured by that focus. And I think as journalists, we should be trying to understand what this overwhelming focus on him obscures. And I think it's arguable that he's not even the most interesting or coherent person to understand. I mean, there are some wonderful lines that have been spun on Elon. I'm very taken with him being the most intelligent 15-year-old in the world. It's tempting to kind of dwell on those kinds of things. I think it's useful to look at who else is proximate to power and whether or not they might have a more coherent agenda, because for all of the things that we might accuse Musk of, having a coherent agenda isn't really one of them. There's been too much of an immediate fixation with stock market prices as a means, as a proxy for understanding what big tech actors and tech billionaires are extracting from their proximity to power. I think we've just had a really graphic demonstration of how temporary the lessons that can be drawn from that are. I mean, if we're just going to look once a month to see if they're 300 billion up or 300 billion down in their net worth, it's practically meaningless. I think it makes much more sense to pay attention to the regulatory agenda that sits alongside that. I would draw, many of the people in this room have doubtless looked at it already, but an executive order issued by the Trump presidency on February 12th makes for kind of terrifying reading. If you see the order, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not strange enough to be able to recall the entire of the title of the order. But in shorthand, it says that the order is a list of threats from the US government to anybody who, in their words, is extorting US technology companies abroad. And it makes plain how the full might of the US state, from trade potentially even to different kinds of punitive actions, can be used on any third country that is doing any form of regulation around technology at all. It's so, the bounds of it are so loose that I think you kind of need an analogy to wrap your head around it. So I think you would have to say that this would have been at the height of the power of big tobacco. This would have been akin to the White House making it plain that any third country anywhere in the world found having a public health policy would face punitive action from the White House. So I think it's much more important to spend our time and attention there. I've been really reluctant to do this. I think many other journalists have been really reluctant to go down this rabbit hole. But one of the terms that you won't find in an analysis of coverage is the network state, which is something which is beginning to be talked about. It's an ideology and a prospectus, a set of ideas which have been pushed and are most primarily associated with Peter Thiel, another tech investor and fellow traveler of Musk's from the early days, from PayPal onwards. But the network state is essentially a prospectus for creating corporate-led city-states outside of government control and regulation. And there are people now, not least the Vice President of the United States, who has been incredibly close to and is deeply involved with actors pushing this agenda. There are experiments going on from Honduras and El Salvador to California and many other places besides, where people who until very recently were considered to be kind of mainstream, almost liberal venture capital actors and among the most significant investors in the tech space around the world, who are deeply involved in that. It's interesting to kind of go back 8 years. I'm thinking of a Vox article, which was then explaining, it's a really good piece, delving into who the neo-reactionaries were, this group coming together around some fringe would-be philosophers like Curtis Yarvin, who's another guy who's going to be talked about a lot more of late. And that was talking about the rise of states, of cities under corporate control outside of nation states that would function using crypto and would be run with no form of democratic representation at all. And at that time, this was seen as like a little wrinkle in the story of the alt-right. But if you look back to who the characters were at that point, there was a suggestion that Elon could be their king. It sounds bonkers. I feel like I'm kind of catching a conspiracy bug almost just by listing this out. But all I'm doing is, and there are some great reporters working on this at the moment, and there have been some people who were voices in the wilderness for a long time, like Shanley Kane or Gil Duran, who have kept pursuing these guys, their ideas, the books, the prefaces they write, and the stuff that they publish themselves, the blogs that they follow and comment on. So it's all hiding in plain sight. So I would say that there are some really troubling aspects of tech's proximity to power, which are not best covered by paying undue attention to some crazy shit that Elon said today.
Thanks. Towards the start of your answer, you were mentioning the need to focus on the regulatory agenda and competing visions for how we govern tech with democratic scrutiny. That leads me to turn to you, Natalia. Obviously, tech's challenge to Brazilian democracy is not a new topic. It's not a new thing. You have personally plenty of experience in the topic. What do you think journalists in the global north need to learn from Brazil's experience today?
First of all, thank you for having me here.
Mike.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for asking about Brazil, because Brazilians here know that Brazil is in a very, very special place in the fight between democracy and some tech-governed, AI-governed autocracy that is the battle for our future. So even though the northern media is not paying attention to Brazil, big tech is. And the reason is that Brazil is a huge market. It's one of the top 5 markets to all of the big brands. 212 million people, 84% use the internet. Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp have over 130 million users in Brazil. And Brazil has a spillover effect. So if something changes in the law in Brazil, big tech knows that there is a high probability that other countries around Brazil, in South America, and Latin America are going to adopt the same laws. So they pay a lot of attention. They have Brazilian offices that are big, except for Twitter. I'm going to explain that. And they have people. They hire the best minds of Brazilian journalism. They co-opt people in civil society. They are watching us very closely. And they care. And Brazil is in kind of like a bizarro parallel moment with the US. I don't know if you know, but I'm going to give like a quick short story of my country, of my country's struggles in the past years. So just like the US, in 2020, Trump's whole, the big line, the whole thing about fraud in the elections, how Trump called it there was a fraud. 2 years later, Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, did exactly the same, in exactly the same way. There was a false narrative that was propagated in Brazil by his cronies, his close circle, and also like dozens of politicians. And then 2 years after January 6, Brazil had its own January 6, which was January 8, exactly in the same manner. Our houses of power were invaded by a mob, and they were trying to stop the new president, who already was in place, actually, to continue being a president. But Brazil took a very different turn. And the reason we did is because our Supreme Court is very strong, and we also have an electoral court, which the US does not. But should. So then after that happened, and of course the insurrection was squashed, very quickly Bolsonaro was made unfit for office, so he cannot run for another election until 2030. He's being criminally charged, and many of the people who invaded went straight to jail and then received very harsh sentences. The other thing that Brazil did is try to regulate social media and big tech in general. So social media, search engines, message services, basically by trying to say that they are responsible for illegal content and they have to preemptively remove this content, and then other measures as well. This attempt at regulating big tech was met with fierce and blunt and abusive resistance by big tech, which was later investigated, but Google used its homepage to say that the internet was going to be spoiled, that you're not going to know what's true or not, just basically because they were going to spend some money on moderation. And these happened, there's a huge struggle, there's a huge regulatory struggle that happened in Brazil and did not get covered. This is one big story. The other big story that is a follow-up to that regulatory, Big Tech won, by the way. They killed the bill in Brazil. They won. By playing dirty, but they did win. The other story, now disagreeing with my colleague here, is Elon Musk. And I do think we have to cover Elon Musk, but we have to cover Elon Musk in some specific things that he's doing that we really should pay attention to. So one of the stories, for instance, is that Elon Musk is at war with the Brazilian Supreme Court judge, who is the guy who is actually investigating the weaponization of misinformation as a way to destroy our democracy. So our justice system went further than the US in that it's really trying to criminally charge people who are using misinformation campaigns, not only to erode the trust in our electoral system or in our elections, but also to dox and threaten the lives of lawmakers, of people, judges and police officers. So then this judge, Alexandre de Moraes, asked some accounts to be removed. These accounts were doxing and threatening police officers. Musk refused and started a whole campaign saying that Brazil was censoring Twitter. This is what ended up in Twitter being blocked in Brazil for 40 days, and then Musk needed to backtrack. But in the middle of that, Musk did a Twitter files Brazil. So he used exactly the same strategy that he used the US in Brazil 1 year later. I'm saying that this is a bizarre world because really so many things that happen in the US happen 1 year, 2 years later in Brazil, and it is the same characters, and the northern media is not paying attention. Another huge story. Another huge story that you should pay attention to, and these are just some ideas of topics you could follow. So not only Elon Musk, and then Elon Musk backtracked, but he has tweeted this government is not going to win the next election. So they're watching very closely, and he is very closely allied with the Bolsonaro crew. Another very interesting story to follow is that Trump's Truth Social and Rumble, who has one of the largest shareholders in J.D. Vance, so that is the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States, are suing Judge Moraes, our Supreme Court Justice in Miami, saying that he cannot rule against their companies because these companies are not based in Brazil. And that the American Congress, some American Republicans in the US Congress are going to pass a law to retaliate against this judge. So all of these things are happening. They are part of a war in which you've got the extreme right, big tech, and the Trump government against a country that is basically trying to protect its own democracy. And I'll tell you, it's so hard to tell my American colleagues about this or to make them care. And the reason they should care is because Brazil is the second largest democracy in the hemisphere. If we lose our democracy, it's going to take much longer for Americans to regain theirs. So,
thanks, Natalia. It's fair to say, as you very eloquently showed, that Brazil's story is so significant yet so underreported in the global discourse. Now, a question for you, Hajira. One thing the data from our research shows is that even if some countries are underreported, there's actually plenty of reporting on tech societal impact. What's not showing up are the human stories within that coverage. So it seems like we're often getting stuck at that macro level. To give you one example, in print media in those 3 markets I mentioned, only 5% of articles include a personal story of someone directly affected, whether that's through online hate, for example, algorithmic discrimination, the impact on mental health, or the way platforms have demonstrably fueled social unrest or conflict, as Amnesty has documented. Another data point is that when people are quoted in these stories, they're almost always white men. So my question to you is, how does Amnesty International, as the world's leading human rights organization, approach this intersection of tech and human rights? And how do you make sure that your investigations help promote survivors' testimonies over and above the CEOs and others?
Oh God, these tech bros will be the end of me. I mean, first of all, I'm not surprised by the fact that how a lot of the experts in print media are white men. Another question I would like to ask, like the demographic of the person who's actually writing that particular piece of report in a newspaper. Because I'm pretty sure if an impacted individual or a person who has experienced tech harms or who has experienced border and policing would view the intersection of technology and its impact in society quite differently, and hence you will definitely see a very different news article in place. So I think we should also definitely question the demographic of the writers themselves. But yeah, one way, I mean, we try to showcase the intersection of technology and human rights, and first of all is, of course, asking the first question, like, who exactly is our audience? But at the same time, trying to understand the whole socio-technical aspect of these investigations about technology and human rights. And the term socio-technical, I think it's quite a nerdy term. Maybe some people in the room are aware of it. I won't be surprised if everyone's not, but basically, socio-technical basically means that, you know, we need to understand whenever a tech system is rolled out in a certain jurisdiction, it is rolled out in a certain context. In a certain context of laws, legal frameworks, narratives, in a place, and then what technology really does, it exacerbates those pre-existing biases and discrimination. For instance, one example I would give you is the rollout of facial recognition technology in the West Bank, and basically how that has led to mass surveillance and oppression and targeting of Palestinians. Then the Danish welfare system that we investigated last year, I mean, Denmark is known to be, has this entire positive branding about being the best welfare system in the world, but at the same time how this system has led to risk of discrimination against people with disabilities and people from communities of color and other marginalized communities and so on and so forth. So whenever we think about communicating about a tech system, we try to paint I mean, it may sound complex, but try to simplify the entire socio-technical landscape of the tech system that is being used to target and surveil and dehumanize impacted people and marginalized groups. And then the other thing is, of course, accessibility. So how accessible the language through which we are communicating really is. I think right now, it's quite interesting to see how whenever anyone talks about technology and someone who may not be an engineer or something will be a bit hesitant, and then they will feel that they're not, since they're not the tech, quote unquote, tech expert or a techie, they don't really understand the system and they can't communicate about it. But I think we really need to redefine who exactly is the expert. Is it the tech corporations or the tech bros, or even impacted individuals? We need to start treating them as experts as well. Because let's be real, I don't think so that there is a definite example of what artificial intelligence really is out there. It's quite a vague term, and sometimes it's really done on purpose. It's the more you obscure a language, the harder it is for these tech corporations. I mean, tech corporations basically do this on purpose. So, but it is essential to understand that impacted people can also be treated as experts, for instance, and ensuring that they are also provided with a voice. Because let's face it, an experience of an impacted individual, let's say a worker in Kenya, is more absolute, and it is the truth, rather than, oh, this is AI, and this is going to, create this amazing utopia for us, and it is going to cure cancer and solve all our problems. But if you're talking to an impacted individual, they really talk about the chilling effect that they feel, and I think it is important that we start treating impacted people and marginalized communities and their stories as expert opinion as well. And I think it is, talking about expertise, the new Protagonist Network, they had a very interesting case study done quite recently, where they did outline how a lot of the tech bros and these software folks and tech companies have been are treated as experts by in many articles by the New York Times. So I think we really need to contest these dominant narratives that are playing out there in the media field in general. And then speaking of which, and not feeling quite hesitant when we want to talk about technology. I have noticed sometimes when I go into panels or I'm in discussions, people start apologizing. Oh, sorry, I don't really understand the system, so I'm not going to comment. I don't think a software engineer or any techie out there would ever apologize for not really understanding social impact in society of the technologies that they're coding and creating and propagating for. So stop apologizing, I think it's important that we give more power to individuals and communities who are directly impacted in our reporting.
Thanks a lot, Hajira. And we'll try and take you later in the conversation to this question of how we talk about the technicalities. But before that, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the kinds of themes that come up in relation to the tech impacts, the tech harms in society. So one thing that we are finding in this research is that the themes that come up the most are themes like societal trust, elections, the health of democracy. Those really rank the highest. Obviously, in the so-called year of elections last year, AI and disinformation was a huge concern and preoccupation, understandably. Now, what's perhaps more surprising is that given how deeply these platforms are embedded in our everyday lives, you'd expect tech to show up more regularly in other topics, like healthcare, like child welfare, like teen mental health, discrimination, gender equality. Those actually don't feature that highly on TV or in print in those major global north markets, even though you could say that every desk is actually a tech desk on some level. Daniel, this is a question for you. This is not what the data is showing. These connections between tech and everyday harms are not really showing up as much as you might expect. How do you explain that, and how does Lighthouse go about mainstreaming tech in its reporting?
I think it's worth spending a minute to think about keywords like health. Why is that going to show up in a report like that? Why is the intersection there? And I'd say it's pretty clearly there because it's a shorthand for mental health. And there is a very significant amount of discussion around the impacts of the addictive effects of social media. That is an example where the coverage is speaking to a very existent anxiety in most societies. It's not confined in any way to the global north. And I'd like to kind of think about that, but also take it further in a specific direction. If we're going to think about the intersection between tech and health, my simple message to any journalists in the room is that regardless of which beat you're covering or where you're working, then tech and especially AI is going to intersect with the space where you're already working. It's not a question of trying to turn around and move towards becoming a tech reporter. This is not about the needs or the qualifying as a particular kind of reporter. It's going to be everywhere in front of you. In the case of health, for instance, it's worth asking who are the framers of AI policy? What interests do they hold? How do those interests intersect with things like future health companies? How is health data where you are? How is that controlled? What efforts are there to monetize that data? The ultimate private data. Privacy concerns have been largely flattened. I think we as journalists and civil society haven't done a tremendous job of explaining to people why privacy matters. It's really hard. It's not a simple story to tell. A lot of the results of this report tell you that journalism and people are drawn to relatively simple stories that immediately engage with their tech understanding. There are powerful, important conflicts of interest, and there's an incredible amount of important decisions about our future being made right now. What we've tried to do as Lighthouse is we do have a team. So Lighthouse, for those of you who haven't come across this before, is we're a relatively small investigations team, and we have quite a few hard skills within that team, like data science, open source investigation, financial forensics, which are not typically found across all newsrooms. So we take those rare skills and we then work with media right around the world to try to put those skills in service of important systemic stories. What we try to do is look at the way that tech and AI is coming into spaces where we're already reporting, where we have some degree of expertise. So spaces like welfare, environment, surveillance, health, and migration. I'd like to focus like a little bit of a call out to people in the room, because there is one enormous story which has been pioneered by only a handful of journalists so far, which is data centers. I think it's easy to say, and there's too much exaggeration, like nothing has been covered. There have been some really important work done. It was good to see that in the European Press Prize shortlist announced today that one of the nominees is a story on data centers. We sit in the presence of the great Karen Howe, who wrote an amazing story in The Atlantic, which captured a lot of the insanity of this incredible expansion that's going on, the siting of water and energy-hungry AI data centers with overheating GPUs in the desert in Arizona. But this isn't a US story. It's not a British story. It is a story right now across Latin America. There's an incredible push for new data centers. The UK has just ushered in and cheer-led an AI action plan that calls for the creation of AI special zones, where essentially they're going to strip away planning permission and just allow giant data centers to be built with very few of the safeguards in place elsewhere. Very similar things are happening right across the world, many of them engineered by the same lobbying firms and individuals who are copy-pasting these kinds of regulations right across the board. If you want to get into using advanced tools to detect and map data centers, and if you want to then overlay that with different kinds of data which would tell you stuff about water usage, if you want to it's useful to think of some of these big tech companies essentially as states. If you want to understand their foreign policy and you want to understand their state secrets, then we're going to need a toolkit of ways to report on this, which is handy because that's what we're trying to do at the moment. We're trying to put that together and make it available to journalists all over the world. We're part of a coalition which also involves some amazing newsrooms from Indonesia, Australia, South Africa, and Agencia Publica in Brazil, which is going to try and come together in coalition. So there are the seeds of some really important reporting to be done. There are partners to be found. There is an enormous need for community reporting. Hajira's comments are well received and are really important. I can't sit up here as the only white dude among the panelists and fail to notice in the numbers that it's like 80% of the people covering tech look a lot like me. This cannot be done by one cohort of people. It can't be limited to people who are working in the US and Europe. And some of the most important people in this story are the people who are going to be affected by technology which is being set up in their backyard that is going to, under the pretense that it's addressing them, it's not for their benefit. And that needs to be explored. If you want to come and do some of that exploring and reporting, we would be very, very happy to hear from you. There's a few people from our team here. Come and say hello.
And data centers are such a striking example because it also highlights some of the tricks in some of the tricks of the trade in a way. Because perhaps the greatest marketing trick that the tech companies have pulled is that our data live in clouds. They don't. They live in sprawling physical infrastructure.
Indeed.
That are expanding rapidly. So this is also a good transition to some of the other tricks of the trade. And as you were saying, Hajira, earlier, how hard it is to get to the how of the technology. So Natalia, this is a question for you. One of the key findings from the research is that while the what and sometimes even the why of tech impacts do feature quite largely, it is so hard to get to this how. And the story, as we've discussed by now, tends to get framed in two ways, either in broad and abstract terms or in relation to the antics of individual tech leaders. So what's harder to get to in this everyday coverage is what's happening behind our screens, inside our phones, terms like algorithmic bias, behavioral advertising, data centers, maybe even surveillance capitalism, which are, of course, in some ways technical terms, but they would help to reframe the conversation and lift the veil behind some of these tricks. So how do you go about reframing that conversation and drawing a circle around these systemic issues?
First, I wanted to say that Hajira is so absolutely right in terms of who are the experts, because we're all experts. We all have our problems with big tech, our learnings, our experience. Our life is now so entangled with technology that it cannot be separated, including our loves, our relationships. So the way we relate with work, with money, with reality is, is mediated by technology. So I do think that one of the problems is sometimes experts want to frame things in a way that is too experty. So I'm not sure that we should expect surveillance capitalism to show up in reporting or, attention economy. And maybe this also pushes away journalists who are just like, we're human rights journalists in Agencia Publica. I'm not a very tech-savvy person. I ended up covering tech because it's destroying our democracy and because it's screwing up our human rights, not because I like tech or coding or anything like that. We were pushed. Brazil was pushed for that. Brazilian journalists were pushed to learn about the social impact and the political impact of big tech. So, for instance, there is a story that was huge in Brazil right now, in São Paulo. São Paulo is a 12 million people city, largest city in South America. It just banned mobile phones on schools with huge approval from the entire population, huge approval from all the parents. Do they know what is attention economy? Of course they know. But they don't frame it like this. But if you ask any parent in São Paulo, is your kid addicted to the internet? They'll say yes. What we need to say is, this is by design, which we are not doing. So I'm not sure that the lack of these terms is that problematic. What I think is problematic is that we see covering tech as a technical thing. Exactly. So we don't understand. So even in Brazil, going back to also what Daniel was saying, even though Brazil advanced a lot in covering the politics of tech because it happened and we needed to cover, the data center story is very underreported in Brazil and is happening as much as everywhere else because Brazil has cheap, clean energy and a lot of water. South America has, 1/5 of the water in the world. So there is a rush to Brazil. They're interfering not only with construction, the prices of land, but also a lot of lobbying. And even in Brazil, we've come so far in terms of reporting, we're totally missing these stories. So I'm not sure it's about the name or the framing, but I do think that people understand the concepts, and we as journalists just need to understand how to talk to people instead of like actually, pushing them away with technical terms.
Thanks, Natalia. Speaking of talking to people, we've overrun with the first phase of the discussion, and I want to leave some time for a Q&A. So perhaps we can turn to the crowd now for a few questions. If you'd like to raise your hand.
Hello. Okay. Hi. I'm originally from Ecuador, but I'm living in Germany right now. So I do see the issues of actually getting these topics taken by newsrooms or magazines in some form. So every time I do write about Latin America, it's in very niche places that actually have that as a specialty. But what you mentioned is actually one of the biggest problems we have right now, that we have like a small amount of people who are willing in Western countries like to actually report about these problems, and even less people who have the expertise, like who come from the regions and know the language and are aware of the political situation, who can do this as well, like from that perspective. And I actually wanted to thank you for also saying that we should talk about this. I have the impression in the conference there's a lot of AI talk, and we talk about it like how good it is and how we can use it in reporting. And it's always very difficult to talk about what the problems are, and I do see this problem. So as a journalist, I do want to have these tools and profit from them. On the other side, I do see the problem that there is, and I also want to center back to the people who are being like hurt by these technologies, and also who, and how they're destroying the democracies, for example, in Latin America. So I was wondering, like, how do you, you also work in your field, you might also have contact with these technologies. Lighthouse also has like a team of people who are very into this very technical stuff, and I also wonder is like, how do you walk that line? Because I find it very difficult to like get savvy and try to move with the times, and at the same time not see the problem that it's causing also in the way we are using technology in journalism.
Wow. I have answers to this. So first I'm going to answer to how do you thread this line. So when ChatGPT happened, I mean, me and some people in our newsroom, we jumped into it. We're like, we need to understand, you need to engage with the beast. Marina, who is here, she has developed an impact tool with AI that she's going to talk about tomorrow in her great panel. But we also rushed to establish a policy that stated that never we're going to use a story or a final piece of journalism written by AI. And we were the only newsroom in Brazil to do so. Because many others said we're going to be cautious, we're going to pay attention, blah, 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 blah. But you know, they don't say we're not going to use AI to write stories, and we are not going to use AI to write stories. The reason is what we do is investigative journalism is craftsmanship, and it's the only thing that cannot be replaced by AI. And if we don't value that, then we're really screwed. Which is my second point, and it's something that I debate with Daniel and other people a lot. We're missing out the vision for the future. The only vision for the future that is put out there is done by these crazy lunatics who think that everything's going to be run by AI and it's going to be great. And people don't want that. People really don't want that. But we're falling for this vision of the future that nobody asked if we want or not, and we are not really engaging with people in what is a vision of the future in which we can control this thing, and which is not natural that is going to take over and, you know, displace all of us. So I feel a little bit in the reporting, we're also missing creativity to understand that these are just tools that are controlled by political decisions made by people. And as in every oligopoly that has happened in humanity's history, we need to tame them.
Any more takers for this question?
I think we're running out of time, but I'll quickly wrap up what you just said. It's very interesting because, I mean, as human rights activists and defenders and researchers, we are not contrarians against the technology, and I think sometimes that we are portrayed as such, even in reporting, like, to be very, very honest with you. Our basic standard is, like, if we are seeing an AI system perpetuating human rights harms, we should just not use it. Like, period. Like, that's it. If you know that this AI system is going to perpetuate pre-existing bias or discrimination, then you don't use that system. And coming back to your point here is we need to understand there is a monopoly on narrative right now. Like, the way AI is being portrayed as utopia when it really is not is the core issue over here, and how we are reporting about these technologies is something that needs to be contested and really worked on.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes if there are more questions.
Hi, thank you so much. Was very interesting. I think it's also important to know when reporting on these topics that there is a generational divide on tech literacy, right? So you cannot talk in the same way about tech to people who weren't born with it, who didn't grow up with it, who didn't learn to use it very young, and people who learn to use it along the way. It's a very different way to approach it. And also, I think what's kind of interesting here is that, in my opinion, younger people know these effects, right? They know where the data is going. They know the ecological impacts of big tech, AI. They still use it, right? In that sense, I feel like it's kind of similar to climate reporting. How do we talk about that inconvenient thing? You still want to use it, right? You still want the system because it's useful. And yet you have to know, you do know the effect that it has. And I think my question is, how do we bridge that divide? How do we talk to both sides at the same time while acknowledging that some people do know? And it's like, how do we get them to pay attention?
Shall I speak on behalf of legacy humans?
Sure.
Okay. There isn't a single unitary answer to that question. There has been for some time, and there has been a notable acceleration in recent months in this kind of dominant logic that we're in a race towards AGI, another poorly defined term, and a destination for which the case has not been made at all, but it now has an almost kind of Cold War logic to it. I don't want to sound like the person whatever the question is, the answer is data centers. But we've just reversed the energy transition, reintroduced the idea of nuclear power at scale as a solution. We're terraforming the planet. It's the largest infrastructure project. I don't think there has been another equivalent global infrastructure project of anything like the same speed. There are tens and hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in new sites being broken all of the time. And I don't think that there is a clear sense of that across any of the generations. I don't think someone has made a case to digital natives of what the benefits will be for them of a post-singularity moment. And I do think that the people who are driving that have an almost kind of end-of-days cultish element to what they're driving. And they shut down debate and conversation about that at the highest levels, by saying that it is the only route to economic growth. So these are incredibly simplistic arguments. I don't think that they relate. To pick up, I try for the sake of fun not to agree with Natalia too often, but I'm gonna have a go now. Yeah, I'm gonna agree. I don't think. There's very little evidence that human communities are interested in this kind of end-of-days destination. I don't think that there's much intergenerational conflict there in a rejection of that as a final destination. And I've been speaking for a while.
Thanks, Daniel. I think we're at time. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Hajira, Natalia, and Daniel for being on our panel today. And I'll use my mic privileges to let you know that Luminate are organizing another panel tomorrow at 2 p.m. On how journalists can safely investigate tech in 2025. So have a look in the program, 2 p.m. tomorrow. Thanks.